sister of my wife manipulated her and forced her to steal money from our capital. So, my name is Brandon Carter, and I am 41 years old. I have been building my life with my own hands ever since I turned 22 and left my hometown for the Alaskan oil fields. It was a crazy decision at the time, and almost everybody I knew thought I was out of my mind. But looking back, it was probably the best call I ever made. The oil fields were brutal. Temperatures would dip way below zero, the hours were insane, and the living conditions were rough, to put it mildly. I lived in a cramped trailer with 3 other guys for most of those first years. The walls were so thin you could hear a guy breathing in the next room. Privacy was non-existent, and the food was basically whatever you could heat up in a microwave. But I was young, determined, and more importantly, I had a goal. Every single cent I could save, I saved. No splurging on fancy trucks or big screen TVs like a lot of the other guys. Just work, eat, sleep, repeat. By the time I turned 30, I had stashed away a pretty decent amount of savings. I decided it was time to gamble on myself. I had always been good with my hands and had learned to weld during my time in Alaska because you pretty much had to be a jack of all trades out there if you wanted to survive. I figured, why not turn that into something bigger? So, I packed up my life into a rusty old Ford F-150 and drove back down to the lower 48. I ended up settling in a mid-sized town in Montana where land was cheap and people still needed good welders. Starting the business was rough. I rented this tiny, rundown workshop for cheap, a real hole in the wall that smelled like diesel and mold. I spent the first few months just fixing farm equipment and trailers, working 14-hour days with barely enough coming in to cover rent and supplies. But word spread fast. Farmers and ranchers talk, and soon enough, I had more work than I could handle on my own. I hired my first employee, a kid named Tyler fresh out of high school who knew more about welding trucks than I ever would. Then I hired 2 more, and before I knew it, we had a full calendar almost every month. Now, the shop brings in about $115,000 in net income per year. Not flashy, but enough that Megan, my wife, and I live comfortably. Speaking of Megan, we met when I was 32 and she was 30. She had been working as a freelance social media writer, piecing together gigs for small businesses, mom-and-pop shops, and even a few local tourist attractions. Megan is one of those people who can spin magic out of thin air with words. She loved the flexibility of freelancing, and I love that she understood what it meant to work odd hours and hustle for every dollar. We bought a modest little house just outside of town, a 2-bedroom place with a wraparound porch and a beat-up barn that I turned into a second workshop when the business started growing. Megan set up her own little office in one of the spare rooms and built herself a solid client list. Life wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Every nail, every beam, every late-night coffee-fueled planning session, it was all us. There were tough patches too, like when the economy dipped and I lost a few big clients almost overnight. Or when Megan's freelance work dried up during the pandemic and we had to really tighten the belt. There were nights we ate beans and rice 3 days in a row because we didn't know when the next check was coming. But somehow, we made it through, one day at a time. The funny thing is, when people come by the shop now and see it busy, they assume I must have had some big investor or rich parents backing me up. They never imagine it was just a kid freezing his butt off in Alaska for a decade, sleeping in a trailer smaller than most people's closets, saving every single penny, and building something from nothing. I am proud of the life Megan and I have built. It is not perfect, and it is definitely not easy. But it is ours, and every inch of it was earned the hard way. I still work 6 days a week, and Megan still pulls crazy hours during busy seasons. But we get to wake up every morning knowing that we made this life with our own hands. And honestly, I would not have it any other way. Megan's sister Diane had always been a complicated presence in our lives, but it was not until a few years ago that her influence really started to seep into our marriage in ways I could not ignore. Diane was older than Megan by 7 years, and she carried a lot of bitterness from her past, especially after her divorce, which had been messy, ugly, and dragged out over nearly 3 years. Her ex-husband had cheated on her, lied to her, and drained her financially, and Diane came out of that wreckage with a deep mistrust of pretty much every man she met, including me. At first, it was little things. Diane would make comments when we were all together, offhand remarks that seemed harmless if you were not really paying attention. She would joke about how Megan was always checking in with me if we were out somewhere, saying things like, "Wow, you have to report your every move now, or Brandon will get worried." Megan would laugh it off because at that point, we genuinely did not think much of it. We had always had a habit of keeping each other updated, not because of control, but because we cared where the other one was. In a small town, it is normal to send a quick text if you are running late or stopping somewhere unexpected. But Diane twisted that into something darker in her mind, and slowly, she started to plant those seeds in Megan's too. Over time, her comments got bolder. She would tell Megan that she was too smart and independent to let a man trap her, that living out here in the middle of nowhere running a welding shop and writing Facebook ads for local boutiques was selling herself short. She said Megan should be traveling the world, working for big corporations, living in high-rise apartments, sipping wine on rooftop bars. Diane would say these things like she was just dreaming out loud, but it was clear what she was implying. She made it sound like Megan was wasting her life, and by extension, that I was the reason for it. I noticed a change in Megan after Diane's visits or long phone calls. She would get restless, short-tempered about things that had never bothered her before. If I asked her how her day was, she would sometimes snap, accusing me of checking up on her like she was a child. If I reminded her about bills or plans we had made, it was suddenly me controlling her, even though we had always shared those responsibilities equally. Conversations that used to be easy between us turned tense. I would catch her staring out the window during dinner, tapping her fork against the plate absent-mindedly, like she was a million miles away. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself it was just a phase, that maybe Megan was going through something she needed to figure out. We all have rough patches. But it got worse when Diane started pushing harder, calling Megan at odd hours, sending her articles and videos about women escaping, controlling marriages, sharing stories about friends of friends who left their husbands and found their true selves. Diane wrapped it all up in the language of empowerment. But it was so clear to me that she was projecting her own pain and mistrust onto Megan. The worst part was that Megan began to believe it. She started questioning every part of our life that we had built together. Why did we live in Montana instead of a city? Why did I have a business that tied us here while she could have been doing so much more? Why did it feel like she had to ask me before making big plans, even though we had always discussed major decisions together? It did not matter that I never once told her what she could or could not do. It did not matter that she had always been free to work, travel, or do anything she wanted. In her mind, Diane's voice was louder than the reality in front of her. I will not lie, it hurt. It hurt to see the person I loved, the woman who had once been my biggest supporter, look at me with suspicion in her eyes. It hurt to hear her question the life we had poured so much of ourselves into, as if it had all been some kind of elaborate prison I had built around her. I tried talking to her, tried reminding her of how we had gotten here together, that every step of this life was a choice we had made side by side. Sometimes she would listen, and I would catch a glimpse of the woman I knew, but then the next call from Diane would come, and it would all start again. There were nights when Megan would sit up in bed, scrolling through her phone, reading articles about self-liberation and reclaiming your independence. I would lie there next to her, pretending to be asleep, feeling the growing distance like a chasm opening up between us. I wanted to reach out, to pull her back to me, but I did not know how to fight against something that felt so invisible and insidious. Diane kept feeding her those ideas, drip by drip, until Megan started to believe that love and control were the same thing. That partnership was just another word for captivity. And I was left standing there, helpless, watching the life I had built with my own hands begin to crack under the weight of someone else's bitterness. It was about 4 years ago when the first real cracks began to show, and looking back now, it is easy to see how much of it traced back to Diane's influence. It started with the money, which had never been a problem between Megan and me before. From the day we got married, I handled the bills, the taxes, the business accounts, all of it. Not because Megan could not, or because I wanted to control it, but because she had no interest in dealing with the day-to-day headaches of running a household budget and a small business. She had always said she trusted me with it, and I had always taken that responsibility seriously. But then, out of nowhere, Megan started questioning things. She would look at the receipts from the shop that I left on the kitchen counter and ask why I was spending so much on welding supplies or why I needed to upgrade a piece of equipment that, to her, still looked perfectly fine. She started bringing up words and phrases that sounded eerily familiar, things I had heard Diane say when she was railing about her ex-husband. Financial control, economic abuse, limiting independence. It was like Megan had memorized a script. At first, I tried to explain patiently. Running a welding shop is not like working a regular 9-to-5 where your paycheck is the same every 2 weeks. Some months are great, and some months are brutal. Sometimes you need to invest back into the business to keep it afloat, to grow it, to stay competitive. I showed her invoices, explained why certain materials cost more, why certain jobs required newer, better tools. I even offered to set her up with access to all the accounts if she wanted to handle the finances herself, but she brushed that off every time, saying she did not have the time or the interest. She just wanted to know where the money was going, she said, but it was never really about the money. It became clear after a while that no explanation I gave would satisfy her. It was not about the specifics of what I was spending or why. It was about the idea, the fear that had been planted in her that I was somehow using money as a way to control her, to keep her dependent. It did not matter that she had her own income from her freelance work. It did not matter that she had her own bank account that I never touched. None of it mattered because the doubt had already taken root. There were arguments that seemed to come out of thin air. I would be sitting at the table going through invoices after dinner, and Megan would sit across from me, arms crossed, watching me like I was doing something suspicious. She started asking pointed questions about every business decision I made. Why did I hire a third employee when two seemed enough? Why was I buying a new welding machine instead of just repairing the old one? Why did I need to travel to a supplier 2 towns over when we could just order cheaper stuff online? No matter what I said, it came back to the same accusation hidden under every word. You are not telling me everything. You are hiding something. You are trying to control me. It hurt in a way that is hard to explain. I had spent years building something stable, not just for myself, but for both of us. Every dollar I put back into the business was a dollar toward our future, toward keeping the lights on, toward paying off the mortgage early, toward the vacations we used to dream about when things were tight. I never saw the business or the money as mine. It was ours. But somewhere along the way, Megan stopped seeing it that way. One night, after an especially ugly fight over a $2,500 equipment purchase that I had told her about weeks before, but she had clearly not been paying attention to, I sat down and laid everything out for her. Every bank statement, every invoice, every payment. I went through it line by line, showing her where every penny had gone. It took hours, and by the end of it, I was exhausted, frustrated, and honestly a little humiliated. Megan just sat there, arms still crossed, and said, "It still feels like you are making all the decisions without me." I did not know what to say to that. I had offered to include her, to share the work, to hand over the control she suddenly claimed she wanted, and she had refused. What she really wanted, I realized, was not to share the responsibility, but to have the ability to criticize without having to carry any of the burden herself. And worse, it felt like no matter what I did, I had already been judged and found guilty by someone who no longer trusted me. That was when I first understood that the real battle was not about receipts or equipment or even the money itself. It was about the stories Diane had been feeding her, the idea that she needed to break free, that anything she depended on me for was a chain around her neck instead of a hand held out in partnership. From that point on, it felt like I was trying to patch up a sinking ship while someone kept drilling new holes just out of sight. I remember the exact moment I found out the money was gone because it felt like the bottom dropped out of my stomach. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I had stopped by the bank after work to make a payment on some new equipment we had ordered for the shop. Nothing unusual, just part of the regular cycle of keeping the business running. I pulled up the account on the bank's computer and immediately noticed that the balance was way lower than it should have been. At first, I thought it must be a mistake, some kind of delay in a deposit clearing or a check hitting earlier than expected. But when I looked closer, there it was plain as day. $6,000 had been withdrawn just a few days before. My first thought was panic. Had our account been hacked? Had someone gotten a hold of our debit card? I went straight to the teller and asked her to print a detailed transaction history. She did, and when she handed it to me, I saw the withdrawal was not from some scammer halfway across the world. It was a direct transfer to a personal account under Megan's name. Driving home, my mind raced in a million different directions. Maybe there was a good reason. Maybe she had just forgotten to tell me. Maybe it was something urgent. I kept trying to talk myself down, to believe that it was some simple misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew things had been shifting between us for a long time, and this felt different. This felt like a line had been crossed. When I walked into the house, Megan was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, sipping coffee like it was any other day. I sat down across from her, put the printed transaction sheet on the table, and asked as calmly as I could manage, "Megan, can you tell me why $6,000 just disappeared from our account?" She barely glanced at the paper before leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms in that way that had become all too familiar lately. Her face hardened, and without a flicker of guilt or even surprise, she said, "I do not have to ask your permission to spend my own money." I blinked, trying to process what I was hearing. "Megan, it is not just your money. It is our joint account. You cannot just pull that kind of money without talking to me. What if I had written checks against that balance? What if it had caused us to miss payments?" That is when she said it, the words that I would never be able to forget no matter how much I wanted to. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You are an abuser. Controlling the money is financial abuse. I have the right to use the money whenever I want without your approval." I just sat there, staring at her, feeling like the air had been punched out of my lungs. Megan, the woman I had built my life with, the woman I had trusted completely, was looking at me not like a partner or a friend or even someone she once loved, but like an enemy. like a villain in some story Diane had written for her. I tried to reason with her, to explain that it was not about control, it was about communication, about making sure we were on the same page financially, the same way we always had been before. I reminded her that we had agreed, years ago, that big withdrawals from our joint account would be discussed first, so neither of us would ever be blindsided. But she would not hear it. She just kept repeating that she did not need my approval, that my even questioning it was proof that I was some kind of oppressor. I asked her where the money had gone, what it had been spent on, but she refused to tell me, saying only that it was none of my business. $6,000, money we had both earned and saved, and I was not even allowed to know what it had been used for. I sat there at that table for a long time after she left the room, staring at the printout, feeling something inside me start to break in a way I had never felt before. It was not about the money. It was about the trust, the foundation that I had always believed we stood on, being ripped out from under me. Megan did not see me as a partner anymore. She saw me as a threat, an obstacle to her independence, a symbol of the life she had been convinced was some kind of prison. And in that moment, I realized that no amount of patience, no amount of explaining, no amount of trying to be the man she had once loved was ever going to undo the damage that had already been done. 2 days after that argument, when the air in the house still felt heavy and wrong, I got the text message that ended everything. It was early in the morning, just after 6, and I had barely gotten any sleep the night before, tossing and turning while replaying every word, every look Megan had thrown at me during that awful confrontation about the missing money. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and without thinking, I grabbed it, half hoping it was Megan wanting to talk, wanting to make things right. Instead, it was a message so cold and final it might as well have been carved in stone. Brandon, I want a divorce. All communications are through my attorney, John Weston. That was it. No explanation, no apology, no emotion, just a handful of words that cut through everything we had built over the past decade like a knife. I sat there staring at the screen, reading the message over and over again as if somehow it would change if I blinked enough times. It did not. The finality of it hit me harder than I thought anything could. After everything we had been through together, after all the sacrifices and late nights and dreams we had shared, this was how it ended. Not with a conversation, not even with a screaming match, but with a text message that barely took her 5 seconds to write. I do not know how long I sat there, but eventually, my hands moved almost on their own. I typed back a single word, understood. I did not beg, did not plead, did not try to call her. I knew there was no point. Megan had already made her choice long before she hit send. The woman I loved had been slipping away piece by piece for years, and now she was gone completely. Once I sent the message, something inside me shifted. The numbness turned into something sharper, more focused. I stood up, pulled on my boots, and started making calls. I contacted my own lawyer, explained the situation, and set up an appointment. I went through the house, pulling together any paperwork I thought I might need, gathering business records, tax documents, anything that could become ammunition in what I already knew was going to be an ugly fight. I called the bank to protect the business accounts and opened a separate personal account just in my name. I moved through it all like a machine, methodical and deliberate, because the one thing I knew for certain was that if Megan was already working with an attorney, she was not coming back to talk or to fix anything. She was coming to take whatever she could. I could not afford to sit around feeling sorry for myself or wondering where it had all gone wrong. That time was over. The only thing left to do was survive the wreckage and try to salvage what little pieces of my life I could still call my own. After I sent that simple, understood reply, I knew I could not waste a single minute. My head was pounding from the lack of sleep and the constant churn of anger and sadness, but I had to move. That same morning, I called my closest friend, Kevin Brooks. Kevin and I had known each other since high school, and if there was anyone whose advice I could trust during a time like this, it was him. He had gone through his own ugly divorce a few years back, and he knew exactly how fast things could get out of hand if you were not careful. When Kevin picked up the phone, I barely got out the words before he interrupted me. He told me to act immediately. No waiting, no second-guessing, no hoping things would settle down. He said, "Brandon, you have to protect yourself. Today, not tomorrow. Today." His voice was firm, the kind of serious tone you do not argue with. I hung up the phone and got to work right away. The first thing I did was drive straight to the bank and block Megan's access to all our joint accounts. I sat in that office across from the bank manager, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, and I watched as she made the changes in the system. Megan would no longer be able to move a dime out of those accounts. It felt cold, even cruel in a way, but I reminded myself that she had already made her move. I was just catching up. Next, I logged into the online banking app on my phone and canceled the automatic monthly transfer of $2,800 that I had been sending to Megan's personal account. It was money we had agreed on years ago when she had first gone fully freelance, a way to make sure she never had to worry about bills if work was slow. Back then, it had been an act of love, a gesture of support. Now, it was a liability I could not afford. After that, I called the credit card companies and revoked her access to every single card tied to my name. It was awkward explaining it to the customer service reps, but I did not care. I needed the financial bleeding to stop immediately. I requested new cards, new numbers, and new PINs, making sure that even if Megan tried, she would not be able to rack up any debt in my name while the divorce dragged on. Finally, I pulled the paperwork for the car lease out of the filing cabinet in my office. The car Megan drove was leased under my business, something we had set up years ago to save a little on taxes. I called the leasing company and started the process to transfer the lease fully into her name. I knew it would be a mess and that she might fight it, but I did not care anymore. I was not going to be financially tied to someone who saw me as her enemy. The whole process took the better part of the day, and by the time I was finished, it felt like I had been running a marathon with no water break. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline crash, and my head was throbbing, but at least I knew I had done what needed to be done. It was not about revenge or punishment. It was about survival. Megan had made it clear she was ready to fight, and thanks to Kevin's blunt warning, I had at least given myself a fighting chance. I knew it was only the beginning of what was going to be a brutal and painful road, but for the first time in days, I felt like I had taken back a little bit of control over my own life. The morning after I cut Megan off from the accounts and canceled every tie I could think of, I kept moving because I knew standing still would only make things worse. Kevin had given me one more piece of advice before we hung up that first day. Get a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. Someone ruthless, someone who knew how to handle people who wanted to play dirty. He even gave me a name, someone he had heard about from a friend who had survived a similar nightmare. That is how I found myself sitting across the desk from Louise Grant. Louise was nothing like I expected. She was in her mid-50s, sharp as a blade, and had the calm, intimidating presence of someone who had spent years tearing people apart in courtrooms. She had been a prosecutor for almost 20 years before switching to family law, and within the first 5 minutes of talking to her, I knew I had made the right call. She did not sugarcoat anything. She told me straight that based on the way Megan had handled things already, this was not going to be a peaceful or fair divorce. She said it was going to get nasty fast, and that if I wanted to protect myself, I had to be absolutely meticulous. The first thing Louise told me to do was start documenting everything. Every call, every email, every text message, every financial transaction. If Megan so much as sent me a grocery list or a happy birthday message, it needed to be saved, cataloged, and time-stamped. She handed me a notebook, the old-fashioned paper kind, and told me to keep it next to me at all times. Every interaction, no matter how small, needed to go into that notebook with a date and a short description. She also had me set up a separate email address, just for divorce-related communication, so that nothing could get lost or buried under work or personal messages. If Megan tried to manipulate things later, if she accused me of anything or tried to twist the facts, Louise said, we would have a full timeline ready to defend myself. Sitting there listening to her lay it all out, it hit me just how serious this was going to get. I was not just losing my marriage. I was stepping into a war where the truth might not be enough to protect me if I could not prove it. Every instinct in me wanted to believe that Megan would not sink that low, that even after everything, there was some line she would not cross. But then I remembered the way she had looked at me when she accused me of financial abuse, the way she had fired off that divorce text like I was a stranger she barely tolerated. I realized I could not afford to be naive anymore. When the meeting ended, I left Louise's office with a thick packet of instructions, a list of documents I needed to gather, and a sick, heavy feeling in my gut that did not go away no matter how many times I tried to shake it off. Connecting the dots of the past few years, the slow drip of Diane's poison, the growing resentment in Megan's eyes, the missing money, the lawyer's name already lined up before she even told me. It all made sense now. This had not been a sudden decision. It had been planned, maybe for a long time. And now, with Louise's help, I was finally preparing myself for the fight I never wanted but had no choice but to face. 3 days after meeting with Louise and putting everything into motion, my phone rang while I was at the shop trying to focus on a rush job for one of my oldest clients. I almost ignored the call because the last thing I wanted was another distraction, but when I saw the caller ID said John Weston, Megan's lawyer, I knew I had to pick up. His tone was sharp from the start, full of that manufactured outrage lawyers seem to perfect after years of practice. He jumped right in without so much as a hello. He said, Brandon, we have a serious problem. Megan has informed me that all of the joint accounts have been frozen and that her credit access has been revoked. This is completely unacceptable, and frankly, it looks very bad on you. I stood there holding the phone against my ear, the welding torch cooling off in my other hand, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I waited until he finished his little speech, then I answered in the same, even tone I had practiced with Louise. I said, "John, I am following Megan's exact instructions. She informed me 2 days ago that all communication was to go through attorneys. I am simply respecting her wishes. If there is a concern about access to funds, you are welcome to send a formal request through your office, and my attorney will review it." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you someone was expecting you to roll over and start apologizing. When I did not, John cleared his throat and said something about hoping we could resolve things amicably, but his voice had lost that confident bite. I repeated that any further discussion would need to happen between him and Louise, and then I politely, but firmly ended the call. Hanging up, I could almost picture the scene. Megan sitting there fuming, realizing that she no longer had the financial lifeline she had counted on. It was not about starving her or punishing her. It was about drawing a line. She had made it clear she saw me as an opponent, not a partner, and I was finally acting accordingly. It was a strange feeling, being the one who stayed calm while someone else panicked. For months, maybe even years, I had been the one scrambling to keep everything together, trying to fix things, trying to explain myself, trying to make it all make sense. But not anymore. Now, I just followed the plan, documented everything, and let my lawyer handle the rest. Megan wanted to turn our lives into a battlefield, and I was done pretending it was anything else. The first court hearing came faster than I expected, and even though Louise had prepared me for what to expect, sitting there in that courtroom still felt surreal. Megan was there with her lawyer, John Weston, sitting stiffly at the plaintiff's table like she was preparing for battle. She would not look at me, not once, not even when the judge called both sides to attention. I sat there with Louise next to me, calm on the outside but feeling the weight of everything pressing down inside. Megan's side came out swinging. Her lawyer stood up and immediately demanded that I pay Megan $8,000 a month in support, claiming that she had become accustomed to a certain lifestyle and that she was now financially isolated because of my abusive behavior. They also demanded exclusive possession of our house, saying she needed a stable environment to rebuild her life while the divorce played out. It was a stunning list of demands, and if I had not been so exhausted by all of it already, I might have actually laughed at how outrageous it was. But Louise did not even flinch. When it was our turn, she stood up and laid everything out with cold, methodical precision. She submitted copies of the bank statements showing Megan's $6,000 withdrawal without explanation. She presented the canceled transfers and credit cards Megan had full access to until the very moment she served me with divorce papers. She pulled out the printed text messages, showing how Megan had insisted all communication go through attorneys, effectively cutting off any chance we had to settle things quietly between ourselves. Louise even brought in testimony from 2 of my employees who confirmed that I had been paying Megan monthly support directly into her account for years, in addition to covering almost all the household expenses. The judge listened carefully, flipping through the thick file Louise had prepared. Every piece of evidence was clean, clear, and devastatingly effective. It painted a very different picture from the one Megan and John Weston had tried to create. It showed a woman who had been financially supported, who had full access to money and decisions, and who had decided to walk away only after securing thousands of dollars behind my back. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was firm and left no room for argument. He said that based on the evidence presented, Megan's claims of financial control were not credible. He acknowledged that she might need some temporary support while the divorce was ongoing, but made it very clear that her expectations were wildly out of touch with reality. He awarded her $2,400 a month, just enough to cover basic living expenses, and denied her exclusive rights to the house. We would both retain access until the property was dealt with in the final settlement. Megan's face when the judge read the ruling was something I will never forget. It was like she had been slapped in public and had no idea how to respond. John Weston tried to recover, asking for a reconsideration or a delay, but the judge shut him down immediately. The ruling stood, and we were told to proceed accordingly. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was relieved, yes, but there was also a deep sadness. None of this was how I ever pictured our lives ending. I had loved Megan, fought for her, built a life with her. And now we were standing on opposite sides of a courtroom, trading accusations like strangers. I did not celebrate the ruling. I just tucked the paperwork under my arm, nodded to Louise, and kept moving forward, because that was all I could do now. It did not take long after the first court hearing for Megan and Diane to show their real hand. If I had thought that losing her outrageous financial demands would make Megan reconsider her approach, I was dead wrong. Within a week, the dirty tricks started rolling in, one after another, each more petty and desperate than the last. The first hit came through an anonymous complaint filed against my workshop. I got a call from a local code enforcement officer saying they had received a tip about unsafe practices and possible environmental violations at the shop. When he showed up for the inspection, he looked almost embarrassed to be there, apologizing under his breath as he walked around with his clipboard. Of course, everything was perfectly in order. I kept my shop clean and compliant because that was just how I ran my business. The inspection took less than 20 minutes, and he signed off without a single violation. He even muttered as he left that it smelled like a personal grudge, not a real complaint. Not even 2 days later, I started noticing something weird happening online. It was Megan's style, but it had Diane's fingerprints all over it too. They had launched some kind of Facebook campaign, a string of posts made through burner accounts and shared by a few mutual acquaintances, painting me as a controlling, financially abusive husband who had trapped Megan in a toxic marriage. They did not mention my name directly, but it was obvious who they were talking about. They posted long, dramatic stories about economic oppression and women finding the courage to escape manipulative financial abusers, complete with vague threats about exposing me to the whole town. At first, it made me sick to my stomach. I had built my reputation in this town on being honest and hardworking, the kind of guy you could hand a truckload of equipment to with nothing more than a handshake and know it would get done right. Now I had people side-eyeing me in the grocery store and whispering at the gas station, all because of some carefully worded half-truths and lies blasted across social media. Louise had warned me something like this might happen, but living through it was a different thing entirely. I stayed off Facebook after that, blocked and deleted every account tied to them, and made sure everything I said or did in public could not be twisted or used against me later. The last, and probably most pathetic move they made was trying to raid the frozen accounts. Somehow, Megan or Diane managed to dig up some old banking information, accounts that had been inactive or barely used in years, and tried to clear out any remaining balances. Fortunately, thanks to the safeguards Louise and I had put in place, the banks flagged the attempts immediately and froze them even harder. I got a notification from my bank's fraud department, and when I called to follow up, the representative confirmed that someone had tried to transfer the funds but had been blocked because of the legal freeze orders tied to the divorce proceedings. It was exhausting dealing with all of it, and there were moments when I caught myself wondering how it had come to this, how Megan had gone from my partner to someone who could sit across a kitchen table from me one year and then plot with her sister to burn down everything I had worked for the next. But every time I started to feel that old pull of regret or doubt, I would remind myself that there was no fixing this. There was no reasoning with someone who had already decided I was the enemy. So I kept my head down, documented everything, and trusted that when it finally mattered, the truth would be enough to stand on its own. When the time finally came for the mandatory financial disclosure, I had already braced myself for more surprises. But even then, I was not prepared for how deep the deception ran. Louise had warned me that disclosure time was when the real games usually came to light, and she was absolutely right. Sitting there in her office, flipping through the preliminary reports that Megan's lawyer had been forced to submit, I felt a fresh wave of disgust rising in my chest. Megan had always claimed she was financially dependent on me, that she had no real savings, no resources of her own. That was part of her whole argument for demanding thousands of dollars every month. But buried in the disclosures, plain as day, was a secret personal bank account Megan had opened more than 2 years ago without telling me. And it was $26,000, money she had quietly siphoned off over time. It did not stop there. Louise pushed harder, filing formal requests for full transparency, and that is when we uncovered the cryptocurrency accounts. Megan had set up wallets under a fake name and had been buying crypto slowly and steadily, a few $100s at a time, probably thinking nobody would ever find it. By the time we exposed it, the total value was sitting at a little over $11,000. Louise was calm and methodical about it, but even she had to shake her head when she saw the numbers. Megan had been lying to everyone, the court, her own lawyer, probably even herself, pretending she was broke and helpless while sitting on more than $37,000 she never disclosed voluntarily. It was not just dishonest, it was calculated. But the real bombshell came when we got access to her emails and messages, thanks to a subpoena Louise filed against her cloud accounts. There, in black and white, was the proof of everything I had suspected but had never been able to prove before. Email chains between Megan and Diane, stretching back nearly a year before she even served me with the divorce papers. Diane spelling out the plan step by step. First, isolate communications to only go through lawyers. Second, stage a financial control accusation to gain sympathy in court. Third, lock down as many assets as possible under Meghan's name without raising suspicion. There were even drafts of the divorce notice Meghan had sent me, suggestions from Diane about how to phrase it coldly and legally to provoke as little personal response as possible. It was all laid out with chilling precision, like a military operation aimed at destroying me while making Meghan look like the helpless victim. Louise printed out everything, organized it into neat, merciless binders, and smiled a thin, satisfied smile as she slid them across the desk to me. I could tell she was already thinking 3 moves ahead, how we were going to bring this to court and let the truth bury their narrative once and for all. Sitting there, flipping through the evidence of how carefully and deliberately they had plotted all of this, I felt something shift inside me. It was not just sadness anymore, or betrayal, or even anger. It was a kind of cold, steady resolve. They had tried to destroy my life behind my back while smiling to my face, and now it was finally all out in the open for everyone to see. The final hearing felt less like an ending and more like a quiet, brutal reckoning. After months of preparation, endless paperwork, frozen bank accounts, false accusations, and Meghan's dirty tactics blowing up in her face, it all came down to a cold, precise ruling delivered in less than 20 minutes. The judge did not waste time. He made it clear that Meghan's hidden accounts, her cryptocurrency stash, and the coordinated attack with Diane were considered serious acts of bad faith. Louise had presented everything with perfect timing and absolute clarity, and Meghan's team could not offer any real defense once the evidence was out there for everyone to see. First, the judge ruled on the house. I had wanted to keep it, not because it was some huge luxury property, but because it was the life Meghan and I had built together, the place I had poured years of sweat and savings into, the one thing that still felt like mine in the middle of all the wreckage. The judge agreed to let me buy out Meghan's share at a 20% discount, acknowledging the hidden assets she had tried to conceal and her role in dragging out the proceedings with false accusations. I signed the paperwork that same afternoon. That house, the one with the crooked back porch I built by hand and the barn I had turned into my second workshop, was finally mine again, free and clear. Second, the business. Meghan had originally tried to argue that she deserved a piece of the welding shop, claiming it was part of our marital assets, even though she had never lifted a finger for it, never invested a dime into it. The judge rejected that argument outright. My business stayed fully mine, untouched. Every grinder, every welder, every job order stacked up on my desk belonged to me alone. No compromises, no settlements, no lingering ties. Then came the final blow to Meghan's side. The judge ruled that because of her hidden financial accounts, her attempt to manipulate the proceedings, and the clear bad faith in dragging out the divorce with false allegations, she would not only lose her right to any future alimony, but also be required to pay 45% of my legal fees. Hearing the clerk read that number out loud felt surreal. For the first time in this whole miserable process, there was real accountability. And it did not end there. Based on the evidence of Diane's involvement, especially the emails plotting to stage the divorce and create public attacks against me, the judge issued a 3-year no-contact order against Diane. She was forbidden from contacting me directly or indirectly, harassing me online, or interfering with my business or personal life. Watching the bailiff hand Diane the paperwork was one of the quietest but most satisfying moments of my life. When the hearing ended, I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years. There was no celebration, no fist-pumping moment of victory, just a deep, exhausted peace that settled into my bones. I had survived it. They had tried to destroy me, to take everything I had built, but in the end, the truth stood taller than all the lies they had thrown at me. Thank you, Reddit, for sticking with me through all of this. I am curious to hear what you all think. If you were in my shoes, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have cut off Meghan and Diane faster, or tried harder to fix things before it got this ugly? Let me know your thoughts because honestly, hearing different perspectives might help me process everything a little better.